Some of the most remarkable, revealing stories about the past live not only in archives, but in the objects people made, used, and carefully preserved. Today, I'm joined by Lisa Minardi, Executive Director of Historic Trappe, an organization dedicated to preserving the historic places, landscapes, and material culture of southeastern Pennsylvania. Historic Trappe stewards several significant historic properties connected to the Muhlenberg family in Pennsylvania German culture, including the Speaker's House, where I first met Lisa years ago while participating in their hands-on archaeology field school. In this conversation, we talk about how studying furniture, textiles, historic buildings helps us to better understand everyday life in early America, the importance of immersive preservation education, and the excitement surrounding the inaugural Pennsylvania Antique Show, where collectors, scholars, and dealers will gather to celebrate Pennsylvania craftsmanship and material culture. I will be there, just a little teaser. But in general, this is a conversation about antiques, stewardship, and the stories that survive through the objects we choose to keep. Enjoy. Welcome to Grandma's Silver, where tradition meets today. I'm Allie, your host of the Grandma's Silver podcast and founder of the Grand Millennial Lifestyle. Here, we blend aesthetics with nostalgia, engaging in conversations with lifestyle brands, designers, and more to rediscover the timeless charm of the past. Join me as we journey from home to heart, illuminating the past and polishing the present with the gleam of Grandma's Silver. Well, Lisa, I'm excited to chat with you today. You're one of my first guests that I have like a true personal connection with. So I'm really excited to, one, see you again, even though it's virtual, and two, dive into all this exciting stuff. So why don't you go ahead and tell people who you are and what you do?
Hi, so I'm Lisa Minardi, and I'm Executive Director of Historic Trappe in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. We're about 7 miles from Valley Forge, and we have 5 historic properties within the borough of Trappe, several of them related to the Muhlenberg family, who were a prominent German immigrant family, leaders in the Lutheran Church, as well as during the American Revolution and the founding of the country, really, setting up our early government structures and the founding of Montgomery County too before that. And then we also have a Center for Pennsylvania German Studies where we do exhibitions and have a research library and archives.
And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about like where this begins, right? Because you and I connected because when I was in college, I participated in one of the archaeology field schools for the Speaker's House, which we'll talk about today. And that was how you and I have just kind of stayed in touch from there and kind of known one another that way. But it'd be really interesting for people to know that you're not just the executive director, you really are kind of like the impetus of how this all kind of launched, right?
Yeah, in a lot of ways. And, it began when I was in college. So I'm a, local resident from the area. I went to Ursinus College, which is just down the street from Trappe, and was a history major, museum studies major. Got involved early on with this effort to rescue what we now call the Speaker's House, the home of Frederick Muhlenberg, first Speaker of the U.S. House. And it was going to be demolished to build a CVS pharmacy. And there was no way that I wanted to see that happen. And there was this grassroots effort by local citizens called Save the Speaker's House, to try to rescue it. And that was, it got its first nonprofit status back in 2001, so 25 years ago. I got involved in 2003 when I was a junior at Ursinus and, was really excited to take what I was learning in the classroom and try to translate that into real life. So we were able to get some grant funding from the county because of the open space that came with the historic house. And then that led to like, okay, we bought this historic thing, but how do we restore it? What did it even look like? And how do we even begin, finding out that information? And that's where the archaeology field school came in, that, it was a way that in addition to studying the house itself and looking in books and documents and tax records, we could actually look in the ground in a professional, scientific way and look for clues about, the people who had lived and worked on that property.
Mm-hmm.
I remember you as a field school student, and it was terrific, to have every year, this influx of young people to get to share, what we were doing with, and to really learn, through that.
Could we talk a little bit about, you've touched on a bit of the history. Could we dive into that a little bit more for what it means for historic Trappe, what it means for the greater Philadelphia region, even. I know you've touched on Montgomery County, but this is really like bigger than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I just, this is a story of, local, state, and national significance for sure. I really think of the Muhlenberg family as, like these forgotten founders, but, they should be right up there, particularly Frederick Muhlenberg, with John Adams and Jefferson and all of them, because he literally was right there, in the same room. The Muhlenberg story begins like 1742. Henry Muhlenberg immigrates from Germany to really head up the Lutheran Church in America, get a structure founded, bring over more pastors, set up churches, like that whole infrastructure. And so he runs all of that out of his first house in Trappe, the parsonage, which we own, future restoration project there. But then his sons, who were born in that parsonage, so General Peter Muhlenberg serves in the American Revolution. His middle son, Frederick Muhlenberg, is the one who goes into politics. Frederick's born and raised in Trappe, spends some time in Philadelphia, studies in Germany, comes back. He's briefly a pastor, just like dad. But then, he gets caught up in the fervor of the revolution. And unlike his brother who goes into the military, he goes into politics. So he joins the Continental Congress, serves in that for a few years. Then he's only like 30 years old and he's Speaker of Pennsylvania's General Assembly, which is pretty incredible. Then he moves back to Trappe, to live next to his parents. He buys a farm there, thinks he's going to retire and be, a country farmer. But then Montgomery County gets formed in 1784. And here's this prominent guy with political experience, living in the county. So they make him the first head judge, the first recorder of deeds, and the first register of wills. So
Wow.
yeah, for all of that government, it's incredible, right? And
Yeah.
so but there's no courthouse. So everybody has to come to Trappe, to the speaker's house to have all of this government stuff, dealt with. So he's like this hub of county government. And then a few years later, he heads up Pennsylvania's constitutional convention to ratify it. And then he's elected to the first federal Congress and made the first Speaker of the US House. So he sets like all the protocols for, what does it even mean to be the speaker? How do you call sessions into order? How do you, do all the things that make the government run? So it's just incredible. And to think that we rescued his house from demolition and are now about to open it. April 11th and 12th will be the dedication weekend.
One of the things I was also kind of curious about, both because I have this personal history with it, and then also because it's just fascinating and it has, I have to imagine, helped in some way. You have this, I don't think you touched on it, but like you mentioned museum studies, you have this professional background working in with historical objects, material culture. What sorts of things have, and I'm sure this is a long list, right? But like, could we talk a little bit about the influence of material culture from the archaeology field school and how that potentially helped to kind of, I always call archaeology like the puzzle piece, right? Like it helps solve a mystery. How has material culture or things that have been found through or discovered through the field school contributed to what you now know?
Yeah, it's really extraordinary and direct. So, you can read like in the inventory of Frederick's estate from 1801 that he owned, 57 wine glasses or, 3 soup tureens or, a bunch of china dishes. But what did they look like? What was the style? What was the pattern? What were the colors? So that's where the archaeology comes in because, sooner or later, some of that stuff gets broken. Somebody throws it in the yard because there's no curbside trash disposal in those days. And then here we are, 250 years later, digging it up as part of a field school. And so, we've very literally found, pieces that from what the type of ceramics are that we can tell are very likely, from Frederick Muhlenberg and his family's life on that property. And so then that gives our curators, the evidence to go shopping and looking, for dishes and things in that pattern. And I'll give you one of my favorite examples. I don't know if this was the year you were with us or not, but we dug up in the east yard of the house a little flower-shaped finial that would have been, say, on a teapot or a sugar bowl, like on the lid, this little flower that was like the knob that you'd pick the lid up by.
Yeah.
Blue and white, probably soft-faced porcelain. I've been looking forever. Every time I go to antique shows, looking for something with that little floral finial on it. And I finally found a teapot that had like the identical one on the lid.
Wow.
And so, we were able to acquire that for the collection. And I'm so excited, to be able to put a tea table in the house to represent Frederick's wife, Catherine Muhlenberg, entertaining friends, and put this teapot on the table. And then we can show people the fragment and, talk about here's how we figured out that this is what was in the house.
I was not there that year, but I remember I had a really cool pit and I was so excited about it because I was right by the kitchen. Right towards the end of the dig, I found, I have a picture of it. I'll have to post it with this episode, but I'm in the pit and we labeled it awesomeness, I want to say, because it was like, I think a creamware plate. It was like a plate that was entirely in the ground. It was just broken into pieces, but we dug it and it was just like laying there.
We still use that photo. It was a white salt glazed stoneware plate, and we've acquired some in that pattern also.
Wow.
Yeah,
Oh, that's so
yeah.
cool. That is so neat. Yeah, that was like the highlight of that was still the coolest thing I've found. And then I remember I also was finding like all sorts of bones, all
Yeah.
sorts of animal, cow, femur, but it was such a neat experience. And it was so gratifying to know that it was contributing to what you're naming, which is really interesting because I've had obviously conversations with lots of museums, house museums. You're in a unique position because you're really building it, right?
Yeah.
You're not just talking about the interpretation at this point, you're talking about like the curation process. What does that look like? Can you tell me like a little bit of what that experience has been?
I've had a lot of time to think about it. It's been 25 years, right, since we
Yeah.
started on this. But no, it's so exciting. I mean, the house right now, it's still a construction site. There's, work going on everywhere. But I walk into these rooms and envision, okay, here is the wall where we're going to hang the portraits of Frederick and Catherine Muhlenberg, side by side, like finally, after being apart and out of the house for so long. Or we know that they had a piano in the house. And, at that date, it would have been a kind of rectangular piano looking sort of like a sideboard. Well, when you measure, I've pretty much figured out like the wall where I feel like this thing had to have been, positioned against. And it'll work out perfect that we can then have like chamber music concerts and things in that room because it's the biggest room of the house. Or, figuring out like a big corner cupboard full of china will go in the dining room, tables. He did lots of entertaining. We know a speaker. We've been able to also track down some silver that Frederick and Catherine owned. So we found a beautiful silver sugar bowl that appeared in a photograph from 1910 when it was still in the family, and then it was missing for years and years and then turned up for auction at Sotheby's. It had no Muhlenberg program to that point, but their initials were engraved on it and I could match it up to that photo. So we acquired that. It's challenging, to be dealing with this active construction site and then trying to figure out, how do we flip it to a furnished house museum pretty quickly. We have a project going on right now actually related to it where it's called the Naked Bed 2.0 because we did 1.0 last year. But so we have this great Philadelphia Chippendale bed that's being upholstered in the period style. And we're using an upstairs room over at the Muhlenberg House, Frederick's father's house, as the upholstery lab until we can move this bed safely, into the master bedchamber of the actual speaker's house. There's a lot happening, and it'll all converge, once the plastering and painting and everything is done.
Well, let's talk about this a little bit because you touched on this upcoming April opening. And I know that this is sort of all part of the broader A250 semi-quincentennial celebration. So could we talk, because I know that this is not the only thing going on over at Historic Trappe for the 250th. So let's have a conversation about some of those events, what those look like, the significance, what people could look forward to, all that kind of thing.
Yeah, so we're kicking it off, with the dedication of the Speaker's House, April 11th and 12th. We'll have a free open house that weekend, 12 to 4 each day. We'll have hearth cooking going on in the house and tours, of course, of the newly restored house. And we're really trying to get the word out to people that, this is a brand new historic house museum of a founder that is, in our backyards. And, like this thing was common back in 1976. Lots of museums were opening for the bicentennial. But as far as we know, this is the only like founder's house that's opening for the first time for 2026. So we definitely want to get the word out about that. And then the next weekend at our Center for Pennsylvania German Studies, we'll be opening a brand new exhibition, Window to Revolution, and that's looking at the impact of the war in the greater Philadelphia area. And so things like the British occupation of Philadelphia and how that, chokes off supplies to get out to the countryside, but also all the produce of the country farmers can't get into the city. And so there's shortages of butter and cabbages and, things like that. We've got incredible letters written back and forth between Muhlenberg family members, who are on both sides of this. We know like the army is actually encamped all throughout Trappe in 1777. And so, we talk a lot about that. But there will be just amazing artifacts, from that era for people to see, including the original journals that Henry Muhlenberg kept for 45 years. And, they talk about like he's in Philadelphia. He hears the Declaration of Independence read out loud the first time ever on July 8th. And July 11th, he's on a wagon moving back to Trappe. He got out of Dodge from Philadelphia. And, he thought that Trappe would be this quiet refuge. But, the war comes to his front door there too. So we have the exhibit. And then at the Muhlenberg House, we're interpreting this wartime experience. So like the dining room is being dismantled and we're going to show soldiers sleeping on the floor, which we know they did.
Yeah.
The army takes over the cellar of the house. Family members are constantly shipping, trunks with bed curtains and gowns and, other stuff for safekeeping. So it was just chaos with up to 32 people living there. So we're trying to interpret that sense of uncertainty and movement and the war's impact really on the family. And then we'll have all sorts of educational programs throughout the year. I mean, pretty much every weekend there will be living history programs. There's always tours available. So, following like our calendar of events online, we send out an e-newsletter, our social media, we'll be trying to really get the word out about all the things.
I'll pause you there for a second just to add that I'll put all the links to social, website, all that kind of stuff in the show notes. So for those listening, if you go to the show notes, you'll find that all there. It'll be an easy place to find things, but I'll let you keep going because I know there's some more exciting things going on.
At the end of April, then we're launching this, huge new event for us, a new tradition we're calling it, which is the Pennsylvania Antique Show. And so this will be happening in Valley Forge, the convention center located at the casino resort. And, we're bringing together 64 of the nation's, leading antique dealers with a strong Americana emphasis for the 250. And so, we're going to have a wonderful show with incredible things for people to look at and experience and hopefully buy and bring home with them. It's like a museum where you can sit in the chairs and touch the artifacts, right? I love antique shows. But we'll have educational programs in conjunction with that, a book talk and signing by Emily Sneff, our historian at Trappe, on her new book on when the Declaration of Independence was news. Sean McDonald on Coffee Nation, and kind of the history of coffee and how it became an American obsession. And then, of course, we have a panel that you're moderating that I'll be participating on about collecting. So we're really excited about that.
You mentioned Americana this year. Is your idea that the focus area evolves, or do you think it'll stay largely Americana moving forward?
I mean, I think we're trying to emphasize Americana for this year, but with 64 dealers, there's definitely a variety of things. So we're going to have incredible, European and Chinese decorative arts will be there, including this year. We'll have fine art, we'll have folk art. There will be jewelry. We have a flag dealer who has historic American flags and political banners and things. So there's something for everyone, truly, with the show. Yeah.
Now, what do you hope? Obviously, the shopping is a big part of this, but is there anything else that you're hoping people leave having kind of discovered, learned, their takeaways?
To preface that by saying we're also doing a loan exhibition at the show on the Conestoga wagon, and a real Pennsylvania icon. And so we'll have an actual 18th century incredible wagon with all the hardware and everything. But we're also sort of riffing on the bicentennial with this. And there was this bicentennial wagon trade where every state in the country sent a wagon across the country and they all converged at Valley Forge in July of 1976. And so I felt like, well, here's this perfect model about, this antique object, this Pennsylvania icon of history, the Conestoga wagon that drew people to the Valley Forge area once in 1976. And let's use it again for our antique show as a way of showing, look, we're bringing dealers from all around the country to come exhibit at the show. We want to attract an audience, from all around the country as well to come here, to celebrate all things Pennsylvania and Americana and really, the antiques market, which I believe, so strongly in and how important that is, how much it enriches our lives as collectors or just enthusiasts to go and see and enjoy, these tangible pieces of our history. There's a lot of shows have, been struggling. The market has been struggling. There's a lot of talk about, challenges with collecting and rising generations. And, as someone who collects myself and lives in a historic house, like I want to really do everything I can to help turn that around and spark people's interest and enthusiasm. And, like if you can't do that in 2026, I don't know when you could. So like we're just really trying to make this, everything we can to help promote the future of Americana and collecting, in the country.
Can we talk about that a little bit further? Because
Sure.
one of the things that comes up here often is that this is a very like-minded audience. So I think everything you just said will resonate. But also, we talk a lot about how gross mass production can be, really. And I mean, a lot of the furniture, especially, is cheap. It's not durable. It's not long lasting. It's not sustainable. Could we talk a little bit more about why antiques are so important to kind of not just invest in, but to understand and to kind of revisit as an option?
Yeah, I mean, I've just always been inherently drawn to, objects as like material evidence of our history and a way to get at that instead of just books and documents, right? That you may have nothing that survives from a particular maker or person, but, you have their chair, you have their bed, you've got their desk, and it's such a tangible human connection, that this, like, think of the stories that have been told at this table, or take a beautiful brass candlestick. I mean, imagine the conversations over the centuries that object has witnessed. It's really powerful. And I think it's a privilege for us to be able, to live with these things or experience them in museums. They're just such a direct connection to this very human past of makers and users of these objects.
Well, I want to go back to the collecting aspect of this for a hot second, because I think there is this obvious sort of decline. But I think part of that is that it was one of those traditions that wasn't necessarily passed down. If I think about my generation, I'm in my mid-30s. A lot of people my age like antiques, but I think that they can be a bit daunting if you don't really try to enmesh yourself in that world.
An antique show is a great chance to just go and walk around and look at lots of stuff and, train your eye to see, what do you respond to? What do you like visually? What would you enjoy, looking at more often? And I mean, well, of course, people would love to sell you something. You can just look and touch things and interact with them. With 64 dealers, there's going to be thousands of objects on the floor of the show. A lot of our dealers have volunteered to do like casual booth talks, where you'll be able to drop into their booth and they're just going to, share their knowledge and their passion for what they specialize in their booth. And that'll be just a great, fun, casual way to learn something. There will be other opportunities, including, walks and kind of tours through the show floor of various highlights. I'm hoping, to lead some of those myself and share, what I like. Also, the Conestoga Wagon exhibit that we'll have. So the collector from Lancaster County who is, bringing the wagon with him. He's also bringing a bunch of iron hardware and tools that go with it. And he'll be doing, casual talks about that material and showing people, how does a wagon jack work? Or let's lift the lid on this toolbox and check out the inside.
I love how much education you've woven into this. The thing that I loved about archaeology was kind of what you touched on earlier, which is almost like that bone-chilling connection that, you're literally pulling something out of the earth that was once loved or used, and then your mind just starts going with the story that exists with these antiques. I love what you touched on, which was like, how many conversations have people had around this? You live in a historic home. I'm in the 1940s. And I think about all of the history that's happened in the world since then, and like what kinds of conversations have happened in my dining room over the years, like what sorts of things were they worried about or focused on or thinking about in the kitchen. Or so just all those things, like I think to walk around and be able to learn about these pieces, it's just so neat to talk to these dealers and hear some of those stories, because they pretty much know that in order to talk to you about what they're selling you, they know a lot of its history. And so that alone, it's like a storytelling.
Absolutely. I mean, these guys are all, and women, they're all leaders in the field. They
Yeah.
really know their stuff, from, portrait miniatures to silver to furniture, whatever it is. So, they'll be more than happy to share that knowledge, truly. I mean, people shouldn't be shy about, walking in and asking anybody, hey, tell me more about, whatever it is that catches their eye. The show aside, I'd also like to mention, like some of the other programs we do at Historic Trappe. So we offer conferences, usually at least once a year. We have an Americana symposium, where we have specialists. So like this year's topic is on redware pottery. And so we have a whole lineup of speakers. We have a contemporary potter who's giving his insights as someone who makes the pieces. And then we also do workshops occasionally. So like I've taught some myself, where it's like one of my specialties is Fractor, the Pennsylvania German manuscript art. And we'll pull out like 50 pieces from storage and do, a Fractor from A to Z. Here's how you can identify the different types. How do you spot fakes, and distinguish them from originals? And, so I try to pass on like all the tips that I can, in like a 2-hour session. Or our curator, he does gallery walks, on like Wednesday evenings throughout the year for tours of the special exhibit, where people can come in and then they really can look up close and, ask questions of him, to learn more. So we're always trying to share and help people engage with antiques.
The other piece of that is that, you're talking about passing your own knowledge down. And that is a level of preservation. What sorts of preservation goals do you have as far as what people take away in that way?
You mean like historic preservation of buildings?
Well, perhaps, because the speaker's house is a big part of that, right? But preservation of object, preservation of history, kind of the broad term, because you're hitting on a lot of different areas of preservation.
I mean, it's an interesting question, and preservation in general, yeah, is something that I have to think about a lot. One of the things I have found interesting over my career, right? So like I went from Ursinus to graduate school at Winterthur Museum, and then I worked as a curator at Winterthur for many years. And of course, we were taught, like you never sit in the chairs, of course, at the museum and things like that. But then, I was married to an antiques dealer, Philip Bradley, who, was an absolute legend of, Americana and Pennsylvania furniture and clocks. And he's deceased now, sadly, just to give that context for listeners. But, I remember seeing Philip during the setup one time at the Delaware Antique Show, literally sitting on top of a high chest in his booth, adjusting the track lighting. And I was initially horrified, with my museum training, like, oh my God, he's going to break the legs off of this. And this is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. And then I realized, you know what, he's been doing this for like 50 years. And I bet it's just perfectly fine. And I just kind of watched him, and then he hopped down and, gave me a grin and kept going, kind of thing. But you realize, that these objects in general, not everything, but like especially furniture, this stuff was made to last by expert craftsmen. And, it's lived a life. And I'm not saying to do this in a museum, of course, but it's okay.
We're at the antique show. Don't sit on the high chest.
Ask permission. But, if you're interested, it's usually okay to handle something or sit to try it out gently. I mean, as we're having this conversation, I'm sitting in a 18th century Philadelphia Windsor chair here. And, my whole house is furnished with antiques, and I use all of it. And I'm sensitive to it, but I'm not afraid to use it. And so I think that sometimes for preservation, it might sound counterintuitive, but that, if you want to preserve things and pass them along to future generations, like it can be okay to use them and live with them. And that helps them still be appreciated and loved, and, gets them still going down through the generations. When they become unappreciated, that's when it hits the scrap heap or the junkyard or the burn pile.
Kind of going back to the collector conversation, I feel like there's maybe this, and it depends what you collect, right? And this really is like a case by case basis situation. But this concept that antique means fragile, And therefore, if you are someone who's living in an apartment or a condo, or you have a young family, that there's this misconception of, well, I'm not in a phase of life where I can collect or where I could have antiques. And you're calling out something important, which is that not all antiques are fragile. You mentioned the craftsmanship aspect of it.
So when I was at Winter, for a number of years I specialized in furniture. So I was the assistant curator of furniture. So that's what I'm very familiar with. The craftsmanship. So first of all, it helps you distinguish regional identities. How can you tell that something's a Philadelphia versus a Boston versus a New York? And so studying like the construction is one of the ways. And Philadelphia construction, or I think where there's a strong German influence, there's a lot of sturdiness about it. Like in chairs, you see these through tenons that come through the back and are wedged for kind of extra strength. Or on Pennsylvania German furniture, you think of like the stereotypes about German engineering and, strength and durability. I see that in the furniture, that the craftsmen are like cutting their dovetails, but then they're also driving like these little wooden wedges in, like to just make really sure that that dovetail joint is good and tight and, not going to pull apart or twist. Or they're using wooden pegs a lot in German construction, versus nails. And nails can kind of sometimes work their way loose, and pegs seem to hold up pretty well. And it's also something that craftsman could make for himself. He just needed a little whittling knife. He could make wooden pegs. He didn't need to go to the blacksmith to get some nails. So I love those little details, the kind of pull a drawer and flip it over and, look at the construction. I'm always the one who wants to go into a booth and, open the lid of the blanket chest and see what's inside and, crawl under the table and look for writing, or stick my flashlight down inside a clock and look, are there any signatures down here? Furniture is a big canvas to leave a lot of evidence, of the craftsman's hands. So I love that aspect about it. But then there's like the modern aspects of this too. So there's incredible contemporary craftsmen who are out there. And to take a different example, pottery. So we've got this great redware exhibition now at Trappe. We've got a craft fair coming up, where we have leading, traditional artisans recreating, but using their own creative genius for the decoration, but they're making traditional redware pottery or furniture, theorem paintings, all kinds of things. And I have so much respect, for the talent that they bring to it, and the observations, learning by doing, and what they can share about, let me explain why the ruffled rim on this Chester County style flower pot is like incredibly difficult to execute, and only a master potter, can pull this off. And I had no idea until I listened to Greg Schooner, a potter from Ohio.
I feel like I'm gonna have to walk around with you at the show.
Yeah, that's what I'd be happy to, Allie. That would
That's
be
so
fun.
fun. I'll be on one of your tours.
All right, very good.
I love it. Well, speaking of the show, one thing that I forgot to ask you was kind of the stewardship of it all. So, could we talk about what this supports?
So the show is a benefit for Historic Trappe, and specifically, it's going to help support educational programming. Specifically, some of those programs. First of all, we have a spring and fall lecture series that we offer, which is always free and open, to anybody. They don't have to be members or anything. Then we have on Saturdays in the summer another free program called Kids Dig History, which kind of grew out of the archaeology field school concept. Parents love to bring their kids to watch the dig, and we wanted to create a way for kids to actually get their hands dirty and do this. So we've created a huge, I'll call it a dirt box rather than a sandbox, but it's, laid out in, I think it's 6 grids, and each kid gets their own grid, and there's like a wooden bench that they can stand or kneel on, depending on how big they are. It's, pre-planted with stuff, for them to find. But then they get to go through all the other stations of greening the dirt to look for artifacts. They can wash them. They can, learn how to reassemble vessels up in the archaeology lab and, help identify what they found. We get out the soil color books and, help them look at what's the soil like that they're digging in. And then we've added other stations. So we have one in our kitchen garden, or sometimes, maybe we might have laundry or, other types of colonial activities going on. And then we're also launching a Revolutionary Kids day camp program this summer. So that'll be a 2-week program. Each week is targeted for a different age group.
That is amazing. So we were talking about preservation, also craftsmanship. You were talking about craftspeople. So could we talk about a little bit of what that looks like when you pair those together and how that perpetuates and what Historic Trappe is doing to ensure that things kind of have longevity?
Yeah, so I mean, the same thing that applies to objects applies to historic buildings as well, and maintaining, restoring them. And a lot of people live in historic houses, and so we need to have the skilled craftsmen, the stonemasons, the carpenters, the timber framers, the plasterers. All of these different trades are so important to the care and restoration of those buildings. And so we experience that every day with the Speaker's House restoration. And it can be really hard, to find those talents. And then, you wonder about, what's the future of that field? In 20 years, when the building needs a new roof or new plaster or something, you look at maintenance, for something that's hundreds of years old, and you hope it sticks around that long again. So, we really want to be, fostering and mentoring the preservation trades. And I'm really pleased that on the Speaker's House restoration, we have both, highly experienced, seasoned craftspeople, but then we also have, folks who are coming up through the building trades and able to work shoulder to shoulder and learn from them, because they're the future generations, of those trades. We recently got a grant for a masonry retaining wall to do restoration work on that around our historic St. Luke Cemetery property. And so we see that as an opportunity for the stonemasons to be, bringing on hopefully some community volunteers or others who, maybe they're interested in trying out, could this be a career for me? And learning about lime mortar and, how it differs from Portland cement and why it's more appropriate for the softer type of stone, used historically, things like that.
Now, could we talk a little bit about, a bit more broadly about preservation, but the future of preservation? What do you want to see generally in Pennsylvania in particular, even if we want to narrow it down to Historic Trappe and its future? Like, what do you hope for the future of this field, this industry?
I love that question. I'm 42, and so I'm kind of like in the middle, let's say, of my career. I've seen a lot of evolution in the field, and I've, had the privilege to work with much more senior people, and now I mentor, a lot of much more junior people. And I think that it's just so important to be, encouraging and bringing along, younger generations of folks, whether it's, as future curators and museum directors and historians and educators, in addition to all the craftsmen and the antique dealers. Like, there just needs to be a lot of encouragement and mentoring and promotion of that in the field. And that's something, at Historic Trappe that I've benefited from. I mean, I was 19 when I first got involved there and really had zero idea what I was doing. I just had this huge passion for saving this one historic house. So we have 11 employees currently, plus about 15 tour guides. So it's not just me anymore. And most of those are, people who are younger than me, that, I really try as much as I can to, mentor and, model thoughtful approaches to, preservation best practices, but also like strategic thinking about museums and, being willing to try new things. And they bring terrific ideas to the table. If I take our social media manager, for example, he was an intern with us last spring. He needed an internship to graduate from Ursinus. And now he's working for us full time as a social media manager and assistant archivist. Can't imagine life without him at the museum. And just yesterday, we had a class come through Ursinus, and, we're hiring 2 of those students as interns, thanks to a grant, to help out in the archives, and he will be mentoring them. But you also asked about, where do I want to see Trappe going too? I mean, we're just growing so much. I would never have imagined, even just a few years ago, where we would be at today. But 2026 has been such an incredible opportunity for us to set goals and work hard to achieve them. And so, now what is starting to become the new question. So we have, the Speaker's House to open and to integrate that into our tours. We also have this Muhlenberg's earliest house, the parsonage that they built in 1745, which is completely unrestored. We've had to mothball that to focus on finishing the Speaker's House. But I very much want to turn attention to that and take all these incredible craftspeople that we've been working with, train their skills and expertise on that house. So we're going to certainly have fundraising push, in the future to get going on the parsonage structure. But then also, we are outgrowing our headquarters building, the Dewees Tavern. We're outgrowing the exhibit galleries, the library, the archives, the collection storage, the office space. And so, we're definitely starting to think about, some kind of, in addition to that structure, probably building some kind of large new, collection storage, library archives facility, but also having space, so we could have a lecture hall and, have our own events and talk. I do see that in our future, and it's quite exciting.
So I will make sure to post links to as much as I can in the show notes so that people can access everything. I obviously hope that they will come out to the antique show, which I forgot to ask you about, but how will they get their tickets online? How will that work?
So the Pennsylvania Antique Show, we've launched a whole website specifically dedicated to the show. And there is a link where you can buy tickets. There's preview party tickets as well as general admission tickets. And if you're a Historic Trappe member, we have discounted tickets as well, and that gets you free admission into all the museums that same weekend. We also will be selling, walk-in tickets at the show. There will be a ticket counter.
Lisa, I just thank you. This has been so nice to kind of talk about this all and hear the updates and all the exciting things going on. But I'm just excited to be a part of sharing the message of Trappe with everybody. So thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.